G'day, Keith here. Welcome to the Digger History Podcast. About a year ago, I was in Wellington, New Zealand, and I was at the Te Papa National Museum of New Zealand. And if you're ever in Wellington, it's definitely a museum worth checking out. I highly recommend it. But in this museum, they have a Gallipoli exhibition, and it's an amazing exhibition. It's hard to describe in words, but one of the things that really make this exhibition stand out is they have these giant like figurines of soldiers that were in the Gallipoli campaign. So these figurines are about 2.5 times the normal human size, and they are absolutely so detailed. They're amazing. They're made by the Weta Workshop, which is the same people that made the props for the Lord of the Rings movies. But these things are so detailed, so amazing. And as you go into this exhibition and walk around the first corner, you're just struck by this first figurine that just it's just amazing. It's a must see if you're ever in Wellington in New Zealand. So after I visited this exhibition, I was talking to an American tourist who had also seen it, and she was also saying how amazing the exhibition was. But she said to me, I don't understand why the war was there. Like, what was its significance? Why Australians and New Zealanders were fighting at Gallipoli? And it's one thing that even a lot of Australians don't have a lot of knowledge about. We grow up learning about Gallipoli at school, and we hear the stories about the Gallipoli landings and charges at the neck, and all the things that happened, all the lives that were lost, but we kind of don't get taught a lot about the whole point of the Gallipoli campaign. What was the purpose of it? So in this episode, I'll be talking about like the build up, the prelude to the Gallipoli campaign, and what the whole purpose of it was. It's kind of one thing to look back on this 110 years later and say, well, that was pointless. The planning was stupid, and all those things. But it's well, I'm not disagreeing with these things, like that there definitely was some planning errors and execution errors in the whole campaign. But the point of this podcast is to talk about the whole purpose, what the reason why the Gallipoli campaign happened in the first place. Now, there's an awful lot of political considerations in this, and I'm not going to go down the line too much here of politics, because it's highly complicated. It can be like a series of podcasts in itself. I will touch on briefly on some of the main political points, but I'm not going to deep dive into the politics of the whole situation. But I will briefly mention, basically for the reasons of why the Ottoman Empire was involved in the First World War in the first place, and why the British Empire, the British and the French were involved in the Gallipoli campaign. I also need to do a little bit of, for those not too familiar about geography, I just need to go a little bit into geography in this to kind of set the scene of the reasoning behind this campaign. So just a quick I guess overview, especially for those outside of Australia and New Zealand and Britain that kind of aren't real sure about the alliances of the First World War. So what we're talking here about is the Gallipoli campaign, which was the British Empire, including Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, and Newfoundlanders, against the Ottoman Empire, which were at that time in the central, allied with Germany in the Central Powers. Now just backtracking a bit to the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914. Look at a series of events, and once again this is politically complicated, involving countries having various agreements with each other and forming alliances with each other, and a lot of these countries were former enemies that were like now aligned with each other. For example, if you think of Britain and France, who had been fighting each other for hundreds of years before, were allies in World War One. So but I won't go down the political line. But basically, Britain, France, and Russia were on what was called the Entente Alliance. I hope I pronounced that right, but Entente basically mean friends. That they had alliances with each other to support each other, and then the Central Powers, Germany, Austro-Hungary, and then later on the Ottoman Empire. Now, throughout the war, some of these alliances kind of added more, and some took away. For example, Russia left the Entente Alliance in 1917. The United States joined in 1917. Japan also was on the Entente Alliance side later on, and so there was a bit of these alliances kind of developed as the war went on. But for the purpose of this podcast, I'll be talking about the entry into the war of the Ottoman Empire on the Central Powers side. So we could really go back a couple hundred years ago to the Ottoman Empire, where it started to decline. It used to be a big power, and then it kind of started declining, losing territory, losing power, and it was sort of on the way out by the start of the First World War. And just before I go any further, the Ottoman Empire is essentially what's known as modern day Turkey, or Turkey, as it's known as now. So when I talk about the Ottomans, I might inadvertently talk about the Turkish or the Turkey. I'm talking about the same nation here. So it could be argued that the Ottoman entry into the First World War started 100 or so years earlier, with the decline of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottomans were keen to hold on to their empire, and were kind of trying to figure out who they should side with to have the best chance of maintaining and regaining their empire. And at the outbreak of the war, there were those that was saying they should side with the Germans. Those that were saying they should side with the British, and and others were saying that they should remain neutral. And I guess that's kind of a basic way of putting it, but once again, to avoid going down the rabbit hole of discussing political alliances, I guess that's kind of the easiest way to put that. Now a couple of key events that happened around this time. So the 3rd of August 1914, actually one day before Britain declared war on Germany, there were two warships that Britain had been building for the Ottoman Empire that were due to be transferred to the Ottomans, and the British Navy actually confiscated those two ships for their own purposes. Now, how much this actually had to do with the Ottomans joining the war on the Central Powers, it can be debated, but that is definitely a key date, a key event in the Ottomans joining the war. Now, another key event was on the 11th of August, two German warships arrived in Constantinople. So Constantinople was the capital of the Ottoman Empire. It's now called Istanbul. But at the time, the Ottoman Empire was neutral. So these two German warships arrived in Constantinople, much to the protest of the British. But then a fictitious sale was arranged for these two ships, so the German Navy, on paper at least, sold these ships to the Ottoman Navy, so that they, on paper at least, changed hands, and there were Ottoman ships, even though they were still commanded and crewed by German sailors. And these two ships would play a big role in what's to come next. So, as I mentioned before, there was factions within the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman government that wanted them to join the war on the side of the Germans, and there were obviously those in government that didn't want that as well. So, and the Germans were pretty keen to get the Ottomans into the war. They'd actually signed an agreement 3 months earlier, and the Ottomans still hadn't come into the war. So they were getting a bit impatient, and they kind of wanted to force the issue. So there was a conspiracy with some members of the Ottoman government as well as the German Navy to kind of force the hand of the Ottomans into the war. So what happens next was the Black Sea raids. So these two ships that I mentioned earlier, these two German ships that were on paper now Ottoman ships, but still crewed by Germans and commanded by Germans, actually attacked Russian ports in the Black Sea, which so this Black Sea raid happened on the 29th of October 1914. Now these the German crews actually put on fez, the traditional Turkish headwear, to make it look like this was a Turkish attack, coupled with the fact that the ships actually were technically Turkish ships, even though they were German crews and commanded by German officers and supported by factions of the Ottoman government. So this was like a conspiracy to force the hand of the Ottomans to join the war. So on the 1st of November, Russia declares war on the Ottoman Empire, and then on the 5th of November, Britain and France declare war on the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottomans had officially entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. So let's shelve all this for the moment and start talking about geography. So for those sort of not familiar, and I guess I'm not that familiar with the area, but we're going to talk about an area called the Black Sea, and specifically why the Black Sea is so important to Russia. So the Black Sea is a large inland sea that kind of borders Europe and Asia, and the big thing about this is it's an inland sea. So there's only like some very small straits that connect the Black Sea to the open ocean. So unlike usual seas where you can just leave land and just go out into the open ocean, to get out into the open ocean from the Black Sea you need to pass through these straits, and these straits are known as the Turkish Straits. And as the name suggests, these straits are actually under the sovereignty of Turkey, or at the time the Ottoman Empire, and even to this day they're the Turkish sovereign territory. So as you can imagine, to get out of the Black Sea, you need the cooperation of the people that own the straits that you're trying to get through. It's a bit like if you had a property, and in order your access in and out of that property was through somebody else's property. So you can imagine, with Russia being at war with Turkey, suddenly access to the Turkish Straits is unavailable. So that's going to cause a lot of problems. Russia has a lot of ports, but the thing about the Black Sea ports is they're what's known as warm water ports, which means they're accessible all year round. They don't freeze over. So a lot of Russia's ports actually are frozen for a significant part of the year. So these Black Sea ports are very important to Russia's trade. And the other thing that made them even more important was the Baltic Sea ports are kind of over the other side of Russia were being blockaded by the German Navy. So you can imagine the impact on Russia trying to get supplies into Russia, as well as trying to get exports out of Russia. And Russia was one of the world's big suppliers of wheat at the time as well. So Russia couldn't export its wheat, and it couldn't bring in much needed supplies. So this really was quite an issue. So if you think trying to come into the Black Sea from the Mediterranean, you've got to pass through two straits. So first you've got the Dardanelles, which is a narrow strait. At its narrowest, it's about 120 meters wide, and then you've got this small inland sea called I hope I've pronounced this right, the Sea of Marmara. And then after that you've got an even narrower straits called the Bosphorus Straits. So your Dardanelles is where at the start of the Dardanelles you've got the Gallipoli Peninsula, and then at the start of the Bosphorus you've got Istanbul or Constantinople at the time, and Constantinople actually was on both banks of the strait. So it's kind of this city that is on both sides of the straits, and ironically in two different continents. So one side you've got Europe and one side you've got Asia. So Turkey is kind of a country that spans across two continents. So as I said, your Dardanelles at its narrowest, about 120 meters wide, and the Bosphorus is even narrower. I think it's about 70 or just over 70 meters wide at its narrowest. So to relieve pressure off Russia, and to open that supply route to Russia, these straits had to be opened. That they needed to get ships in through these straits, and that meant basically forcing their way through. And this was initially planned to be done with a big naval force. So it was never originally intended to be the big amphibious landing that the Gallipoli landings were. It was a naval force initially with British and French warships, and there were Marines also on these ships. Like they could get off and attack shore fortifications if need be. But predominantly this was just a big naval force that was going to kind of blast its way through the straits, knocking out the shore defences with big guns from the ships. So on the 19th of February 1915, British and French warships begin bombing the forts at the Dardanelles, and then this went on for several weeks, and then the 18th of March is when there was a big naval attempt by the British and French to force their way through the straits. This ended up being a big disaster because the Ottomans had laid mines all through the straits, so that the ships were hitting these mines and sinking, and look, it was a disaster. The naval attempt, 3 battleships were sunk, many more were damaged. So that didn't go as planned. So then, with the naval attempt not being successful, another plan was made that an amphibious landing was going to take out those shore defences and allow the naval contingent to come up through the Dardanelles, and then Istanbul, or Constantinople at the time, was to be taken, and once it was taken, the Ottomans would effectively be knocked out of the war. And look, in the grand scheme of things, taking one of the big players out of the war, one of the big players of your enemy, it isn't such a bad idea. I mean, with the Ottomans in the war, the Russians were fighting on two fronts. They were fighting on the eastern front against the Germans and Austrians, and they were now fighting the Ottomans, and then the British were also fighting the Ottomans in the desert campaign, in the Sinai Desert, trying to defend the Suez Canal. So there were a lot of with the Ottomans in the war, there was the Allies were a lot further stretched. So definitely taking the Ottomans out of the war, the concept wasn't a bad one. So they were the objectives of the Dardanelles campaign: to relieve the pressure on Russia, to relieve the pressure on Russia, to open that supply route to Russia, and to take the Ottoman Empire out of the war. And look, as I said, a lot of politics involved in this as well. So there were a lot of little side objectives and stuff, but they were the three main objectives. with the naval campaign no longer an option. The the planning for an amphibious landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula started to happen, and then the thought was, well, who do we send there? There was British and French and Indian soldiers, but also there was a large contingent of Australian and New Zealand soldiers who were actually in Egypt at the time training. They'd originally intended to go to England to train, but because the infrastructure wasn't there for any more soldiers, because the Canadians were also in England training, so the decision was made to send Australians and New Zealanders to Egypt instead. So they were kind of already in Egypt, and we thought, well, we'll send these guys as well. And that's kind of another misconception, I guess. Well, not a misconception, but something that's left out a lot from when we learn about the ANZAC stories coming up at school. When we're growing up, we kind of tend to think that it was just the Australians and New Zealanders that were there, but in fact there were many more. The Australians, the ANZACs only made up around 10% of the whole Allied forces that were there. There were French, and there were British, there were Indians, there were Irish, and then later on there were Newfoundlanders. So and that's going to be actually the focus of the next episode in this series, the countries involved in the Gallipoli landings. So on that note, I will finish this podcast now, and hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. Feel free to add a comment, share with any friends that you think might be interested. And as mentioned, next episode in this series will be about the nations involved in the Gallipoli campaign. So until then, talk soon. Bye.